What if every financial catastrophe we fear today is not random, not unexpected, and not even innovative, but simply the repetition of an ancient script that the world keeps falling for? What if Madoff, Wirecard, and Theranos were not isolated explosions of deception but predictable milestones in a recurring six-stage financial cycle that is unfolding again right now, right in front of us? And more unsettling, what if the system itself is already deep inside this cycle, and most people cannot see it because they are living inside the illusion that always blinds societies at stage 3? Throughout history, every massive fraud has followed the same psychological architecture. It starts with a promise that feels too good to ignore, evolves into a narrative that feels too powerful to question, and matures into a belief system so seductive that even regulators, investors, banks, and entire markets become hypnotized by the illusion of progress. Madoff created a story of stability in a volatile world. Wirecard sold the fantasy of European tech dominance. Theranos offered salvation disguised as innovation, and each of them used the same levers of human trust, fear, and ambition that shape every financial bubble and every economic deception. Stage 3 is where the fraud becomes a collective dream. Numbers look perfect, growth looks unstoppable, media praise becomes free marketing. Auditors nod along. Investors tell themselves that asking questions is unnecessary or even dangerous to their own profits. This is the moment when fraud transforms into culture, when manipulation becomes accepted as brilliance, and when the system becomes too emotionally invested to see what should have been obvious. And if we are honest, many of the signals we see today mirror the exact psychological and structural patterns of past collapses, repeating themselves with disturbing accuracy. But before we continue, let me ask you something that really matters here. Have you ever looked at a headline about a financial scandal and wondered how so many intelligent people could fall for something so clearly broken? If you have, stay with me, because what you are about to uncover may reshape the way you see markets, institutions, and the entire economic system that claims to protect you. Your perspective on financial safety might not be as secure as you think, and understanding this cycle can open your eyes to what is unfolding right now. If this is already making you rethink how these patterns form, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you have ever witnessed a moment that felt like the start of something bigger. Hit the like button so this message reaches more people, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the next steps of this unfolding cycle as we dive deeper into the mechanisms driving stage 2. The moment before a fraud truly begins never looks dangerous. It looks exciting. It looks innovative. It looks like the kind of moment people will later claim they always believed in. Stage 2 of the financial cycle is where seduction takes root, not through lies that are obvious, but through truths that are selective and beautifully arranged. Every great fraud begins by giving people exactly what they wish the world could be. This is why the smartest investors and the most seasoned executives often fall first. They are the ones closest to the dream, and the ones most eager to believe they discovered something groundbreaking before everyone else. Fraudsters rarely start out as villains. Many of them begin with a real idea, a real product, or a real desire to disrupt a stagnant system. Theranos started with the dream of democratizing healthcare. Wirecard began as a payments processor for digital businesses when that industry was still considered the frontier. Even Madoff grew his empire from a legitimate brokerage operation. But the transition from aspiration to deception happens when ambition outruns reality, when pressure replaces progress, and when the fear of disappointing investors becomes more terrifying than the moral cost of bending the truth. Stage 2 is the phase of quiet shortcuts. A number gets rounded up. A report gets adjusted to reflect future expectations. A deadline is met with a placeholder instead of a product. Leaders convince themselves these adjustments are temporary, just small bridges to get them past a rough moment. But once a bridge is crossed, it becomes easier to build the next one. Momentum becomes more important than accuracy, and perception becomes the currency that keeps the system alive. The fraud is not yet fully formed, but its skeleton is already taking shape. What makes this stage so dangerous is that seduction doesn't only happen outwardly, it happens internally. Founders begin believing their own mythology. Investors convince themselves risk is lower than it is. Regulators, overwhelmed by optimism and political pressure, soften their instinct for skepticism. The market rewards speed, boldness, and disruption, and punishes anything that looks like hesitation. In this environment, caution becomes a liability, and humility looks like weakness. Fraud does not start with deception. It starts with the erosion of accountability, one overlooked detail at a time. And beneath it all lies a subtle psychological force. People don't want the truth if the illusion feels better. The promise of a breakthrough, the thrill of backing the next big thing, the desire to be early rather than right. These emotions override logic. Every major fraud in history found its earliest supporters among people who needed the story to be true. This is how the trap forms, long before the world realizes a trap exists at all. As stage 2 progresses, excitement becomes expectation, expectation becomes pressure, and pressure becomes the silent engine that pushes small inconsistencies into structural deception. And this is precisely where stage 3 begins to take shape, turning quiet manipulation into a collective hallucination that the entire financial system begins to celebrate. Stage 3 is where a financial illusion stops being a small internal compromise and becomes a public spectacle. It is the moment when a fraud no longer hides in the shadows, but steps onto the world stage wearing the costume of unstoppable success. This is the phase where numbers surge, valuations explode, and narratives crystallize into something that feels inevitable. Investors call it momentum, analysts call it growth, journalists call it disruption. But beneath the surface, it is simply the mechanical expansion of a system that needs constant feeding to survive. Think of Madoff's perfect returns. Month after month, year after year, they appeared calm, predictable, and mathematically impossible. But the illusion worked because it emerged at a moment when markets were volatile and investors desperately wanted stability. Wirecard's meteoric rise worked the same way. Europe wanted its own tech champion, a company that could compete with Silicon Valley on its own terms. And so the world accepted numbers that looked too good, margins that seemed unrealistic, and stories that dissolved under basic scrutiny. In stage 3, the cultural desire for a hero reinforces the fraud more than any internal manipulation ever could. This is also when founders evolve from ambitious leaders into mythologized figures. Their confidence becomes interpreted as genius. Their secrecy becomes proof of innovation. Their unverified claims become the seeds of a future everyone wants to believe in. Elizabeth Holmes wore the uniform of a visionary. Marcus Braun spoke with the authority of a pioneer. Bernie Madoff radiated the confidence of someone who had cracked the code. This charisma becomes a protective shield around the fraud, making skepticism appear cynical and due diligence seem unnecessary. Artificial growth does not require real performance. It requires the illusion of progress. Numbers can be smoothed, metrics adjusted, revenues borrowed from the future, partnerships presented as contracts, and projections treated as facts. Stage 3 rewards storytelling more than truth, and the system becomes complicit because everyone gains something from the illusion. Investors gain confidence. Boards gain prestige. Media outlets gain headlines. Regulators gain the comfort of believing success is real. And each of these groups becomes psychologically invested in maintaining the narrative. What makes this stage especially dangerous is the scale of belief. Once a fraud reaches cultural momentum, even honest people unintentionally reinforce it. Employees repeat the company's vision because it gives them meaning. Clients trust the brand because everyone else does. Politicians support the narrative because it benefits their agendas. The fraud becomes a collective construction, strengthened by the hopes and ambitions of those who never intended to deceive anyone. And as the illusion grows, it becomes harder for anyone on the inside to speak out, and nearly impossible for outsiders to challenge what appears to be a rising empire. But the expansion of stage 3 has a hidden cost. The bigger the illusion becomes, the more resources it requires to sustain. Maintaining the story demands more capital, more attention, more secrecy, and more manipulation. And as the structure inflates, cracks begin to form beneath the surface. Cracks that lead directly into stage 4, where the need for protection grows faster than the fraud itself. By the time a fraud reaches stage 4, the illusion is no longer growing on its own. It must be defended. It must be curated. It must be protected with layers of credibility that stand between the truth and the outside world. This is when the architects of deception begin constructing an ecosystem of support, one made of compliant auditors, selective disclosures, strategic media alliances, and a carefully engineered sense of inevitability. Because in this stage, survival depends not on making people believe in success, but on preventing anyone from discovering the weakness hiding beneath it. The public often imagines that fraudsters rely on secrecy, but stage 4 thrives on visibility. The more public recognition a company gains, the safer it becomes. Awards, magazine covers, industry rankings, speaking engagements, prestigious partnerships. These signals create the impression that oversight has already occurred, that legitimacy has already been verified by institutions the public trusts. Wirecard was celebrated as a national champion. Theranos appeared on world stages as a medical breakthrough. Madoff served as chairman of NASDAQ. When fraud is wrapped in prestige, criticism appears irrational. This is also the phase where insiders begin noticing inconsistencies they cannot explain. Expense reports don't align. Balance sheets contain figures that seem artificially precise. Technical teams receive impossible deadlines. Departments avoid each other. Questions get deflected, postponed, or redirected to another division. And internally, a silent hierarchy emerges. Those who know too much, those who suspect something, and those who must never discover the truth. The entire system becomes dependent on maintaining distance between these groups. Auditors, who should be the last line of defense, often become part of the machinery. Sometimes through incompetence, sometimes through fear of losing a major client, and sometimes through a subtle psychological trap. They want the company to be legitimate because their own reputation is tied to it. When the financial system rewards growth, compliance becomes negotiable, and oversight becomes ceremonial. Numbers get validated not because they are true, but because challenging them would threaten everything the fraud has constructed so far. Narratives are managed with equal precision. Leaders deliver polished statements filled with technical jargon that sounds sophisticated but communicates nothing verifiable. Critical reporters find their access restricted. Influential investors are reassured privately with curated information. Governments, eager to support innovation or national success, unknowingly protect the fraud from pressure. And the public, convinced by the momentum of stage 3, interprets every challenge as jealousy, pessimism, or an inability to understand groundbreaking ideas. But inside the protected walls of stage 4, something else begins to happen. A shift from defensive posture to quiet desperation. Resources must be stretched further. Explanations must become more elaborate. Small inconsistencies must be woven into larger stories. And every attempt to protect the illusion increases the internal strain, setting the stage for a collapse that grows more inevitable with every layer of shielding added. Before we move forward, share in the comments if you have ever sensed that something looked polished on the outside but strangely fragile underneath. Because these early cracks are often the signs that stage 5 is approaching. Stage 5 is the moment when a fraud stops being an anomaly within the system and becomes a system of its own. It grows large enough, influential enough, and interconnected enough that its collapse would damage not just investors or insiders, but entire sectors, markets, and institutions. This is the point where the deception is no longer sustained by charm or narrative control. It is sustained by the sheer scale of belief surrounding it. A fraud becomes too big to question, too integrated to unwind, and too socially embedded for anyone to imagine its failure without imagining the collapse of something far larger. Madoff reached this point when institutional investors, retirement funds, global banks, and wealth managers depended on his returns to stabilize their portfolios. Wirecard reached this point when it became part of the German national identity as the company that would finally elevate Europe into the modern tech landscape. Theranos entered this stage when its promises infiltrated healthcare policy discussions, military interest, and major corporate partnerships. In each case, the fraud grew powerful not because it was real, but because too many important players needed it to be real. By stage 5, the internal mechanics of the fraud have evolved far beyond simple manipulation. Entire operational structures are designed around sustaining the illusion. Teams are separated to avoid cross-contamination of inconvenient truths. Financial flows are engineered to mask liquidity holes. Partnerships are used as public validation rather than genuine strategic collaboration. The fraud becomes a miniature economy, complete with its own laws, incentives, and internal mythology. And the psychology of this stage is transformative. Insiders who once felt uneasy now rationalize everything. They tell themselves the company is just going through a transition, that every startup has messy numbers, that the market will eventually catch up to the innovation. Middle managers, who might have raised concerns earlier, now fear being the ones blamed if the truth emerges. Silence becomes a survival instinct. Compliance becomes a form of self-protection, and loyalty becomes the moral shield people use to defend decisions they once questioned. Externally, Stage 5 creates the illusion of unstoppable momentum. Institutions that once doubted now double down. Governments highlight the company as proof of national progress. Analysts revise their projections upward. Banks extend larger credit lines, believing they are participating in a rising economic star. The fraud is no longer a fragile operation dependent on secrecy. It becomes a towering structure with tentacles reaching into countless interconnected systems. But beneath this mountain of belief lies a core that has never changed. The numbers still don't match. The technology still doesn't function. The profits still depend on fabrications or circular flows of money. The external success becomes a glowing shell around a hollow interior. And because the fraud is now a parallel system, every new promise, every new expansion, every new partnership deepens the structural weakness that will eventually collapse the entire architecture. The transition from Stage 5 to Stage 6 is not marked by a single discovery or a single whistleblower. It is marked by the growing weight of the illusion itself, which becomes too heavy to sustain, too complex to maintain, and too interdependent to hide from pressure. And as this strain intensifies, the first fractures of Stage 6 begin to spread beneath the surface. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Stage 6 begins quietly. There is no dramatic revelation, no explosive headline, no sudden confession. Instead, the first cracks appear in places so small and so mundane that most people overlook them entirely. A missed audit deadline, a delayed product demonstration, an unexplained resignation, a financial report that suddenly shifts its structure. These are not treated as red flags, but as administrative inconveniences, the kind of issues large companies face all the time. Yet beneath these trivial disruptions lies a structural tension that is beginning to break through the surface. Inside the organization, the atmosphere grows heavy. The confidence that once filled every meeting now feels forced. Teams that once collaborated naturally begin working in silos because transparency has become dangerous. Employees who were once enthusiastic now avoid asking questions, sensing that curiosity carries risks. Leadership becomes increasingly controlled, rehearsed, and distant. The tone shifts from visionary ambition to defensive reassurance, even if the public cannot yet hear it. The people closest to the core, finance teams, technical leads, compliance staff, are usually the first to sense the shift. They begin noticing that certain numbers require more explanation than before, or that certain documents cannot be shared yet, or that certain questions must be redirected to special committees or executive-only reviews. Each barrier is justified as temporary, but collectively they form a wall around the truth, a wall that becomes harder to maintain as pressure increases. Outside the company, subtle inconsistencies begin reaching analysts and journalists. A partnership that once appeared transformative suddenly goes quiet. Revenue projections become less precise. A long-promised breakthrough misses another milestone. Competitors start asking questions. Regulators request additional documents. Investors request deeper audits. These are the early tremors that signal the system is entering an unstable phase, even if no one is willing to accept it yet. Stage 6 also reveals a psychological shift among insiders. Some begin distancing themselves emotionally from the leadership. Others quietly update their resumes. A few start documenting information privately. not because they intend to expose the fraud, but because they want protection in case someone else does. Fear replaces loyalty. Uncertainty replaces confidence. And this shift in internal sentiment is far more consequential than any external pressure, because once people stop believing in the story can no longer hold itself together. But perhaps the most defining feature of Stage 6 is the way the fraud's complexity turns inward. Every false number requires another false explanation. Every missing asset requires another fabricated justification. Every new question demands an even more elaborate narrative. The lies become heavier, more tangled, more fragile. And the more the architects try to reinforce the illusion, the more strain they place on the very structure they are trying to preserve. This is the abyss forming beneath the fraud, a widening gap between the truth and the narrative that once felt unbreakable. And while it has not yet collapsed publicly, the internal equilibrium has already been disrupted. The fraud is no longer expanding, no longer stable, no longer insulated. It is trembling under its own weight, edging closer to the moment when the illusion can no longer sustain itself, and the fall into Stage 7 becomes unavoidable. Stage 7 is the moment when everything that was once hidden becomes violently visible. It is the point where inconsistencies can no longer be disguised, where the strain that has been building across the internal structure finally breaches the surface, and the world sees the truth that insiders have been sensing for months. Collapse rarely begins with a single revelation. Instead, it begins when multiple small truths converge, triggering a cascade that the architects of the fraud can no longer control. The first sign is often a leak. A document surfaces. A whistleblower steps forward. A journalist publishes a detail that should have been impossible to obtain. Suddenly, questions that were once ignored now demand answers. Investors want explanations, regulators want access, and boards want accountability. The leadership that once controlled the narrative now finds itself cornered, forced to respond to details they never intended to defend publicly. From here, the spiral accelerates. Banks that once extended credit begin tightening their exposure. Partners quietly suspend collaborations. Auditors withdraw their endorsements. Employees panic as internal systems become unstable, and some begin cooperating with investigations to protect themselves. What once looked like a towering monument of success now looks like a structure held together by desperation, collapsing floor by floor. Media attention intensifies the fall. Headlines multiply. Anchors revisit old interviews, pointing out contradictions that were once overlooked. Analysts revise their recommendations, shifting from praise to caution, then from caution to alarm. Public sentiment swings sharply as the illusion shatters, revealing that the brilliance the world admired was built on a foundation of distortion. The same crowd that once defended the company now demands accountability, punishment, and answers. At this point, the fraud enters freefall. Executives resign or disappear from public view. Emergency board meetings stretch through the night. Regulators issue subpoenas. Markets react with fear. Stock prices plummet in violent waves, and the narrative, once carefully shaped to inspire confidence, now evolves into a story of betrayal, deception, and catastrophic oversight. It is not the fraud alone that collapses, but the trust of everyone who ever believed in it. Yet even in this moment of exposure, the collapse is not only external. Inside the organization, the emotional atmosphere turns chaotic. People who built their careers on the illusion confront the reality that their future has been erased. Teams fracture, blame spreads, and the weight of the truth becomes unbearable. This emotional shock is often more devastating than the financial loss, because it destroys the meaning that drove ordinary people to contribute to a vision they believed would change the world. If you have ever watched a major scandal unfold and felt that you could sense the unraveling before the headlines appeared, share your thoughts in the comments. The earliest observers often recognize patterns that others miss, and those insights reveal how Stage 8 begins to take shape in the aftermath of collapse. After the collapse, the world focuses on the spectacle, the headlines, the courtroom sketches, the televised interviews, the public apologies. But Stage 8 is not about the drama. It is about the aftermath. It is the stage where the true cost of the fraud becomes visible, not in the downfall of the perpetrators, but in the destruction felt by those who never participated in the deception, yet must live with its consequences. This is where the emotional, financial, and institutional debris settles, revealing a landscape permanently reshaped by a system that failed to protect the people who trusted it. Investors are often the first casualties. Pension funds lose billions, wiping out the retirement security of ordinary workers who never chose to risk their savings on a charismatic visionary or a falsified balance sheet. Small investors, who believed they were participating in a once-in-a-generation opportunity, watch years of effort vanish overnight. These individuals are not just financially harmed, they lose faith in the system itself. They feel betrayed by the professionals who promised to act as guardians of their future. Employees suffer next. Thousands of people who once built their identity around the company now find themselves unemployed, stigmatized, or emotionally broken. Many invested years of loyalty, sacrificing personal time, relationships, and stability for a mission they believed had meaning. When the fraud collapses, they are left with nothing but the realization that their labor was used to support a narrative that was never true. The psychological impact of this rupture can be deep and long-lasting, reshaping career paths and personal relationships. Regulators and institutions, eager to protect their reputation, shift into defensive mode. They launch investigations, issue public statements, and enforce penalties that often arrive too late to matter. These actions create the appearance of accountability, but rarely address the deeper structural weaknesses that allowed the fraud to grow unchecked. The system punishes the visible villains while quietly protecting the institutions whose failures made the fraud possible in the first place. And yet, in every collapse, there are figures who escape the consequences. Early insiders, who sense trouble withdraw their investments long before the public knows anything. Executives secure legal protections, negotiate settlements, or disappear behind teams of lawyers. Board members claim ignorance. Financial institutions that enabled the fraud issue carefully worded statements distancing themselves from the scandal. The people with the most responsibility often emerge with their wealth intact, their reputations bruised but recoverable, and their influence largely untouched. Meanwhile, opportunists emerge to profit from the ruins. Distressed asset buyers scour the aftermath looking for undervalued remnants they can flip for massive gains. Media companies capitalize on the spectacle, turning scandal into content. Politicians use the collapse to reinforce their agendas, gaining support by promising reforms that rarely materialize. Even competitors benefit, absorbing market share and talent from the fallen company. Stage 8 is a mirror held up to society, revealing a pattern that repeats with uncomfortable precision. Those who lose are the ones who trusted the system. Those who win are the ones who understood how it could be bent. And in this uneven distribution of suffering and reward, the groundwork for the next fraud begins to take shape, quietly, subtly, inevitably. Stage 9 is where the world convinces itself that the lesson has finally been learned. Governments promise stricter oversight. Institutions pledge transparency. Investors swear never to trust hype without evidence. Regulators implement new frameworks, and the public believes for a moment that the financial system has evolved. But beneath that temporary sense of moral awakening, something else begins to move, quietly, predictably, and inevitably. This is the stage where the cycle resets itself, not because the world forgets, but because the incentives that create fraud never disappear. The aftermath of a major scandal always leaves a cultural vacuum. Markets still demand growth. Investors still demand returns. Institutions still reward innovation over caution. And society still craves the excitement of a groundbreaking breakthrough that promises to change everything. Into this vacuum steps a new generation of visionaries, some genuine, some opportunistic, and some willing to blur ethical boundaries in pursuit of the validation the market so readily offers. They position themselves as the antidote to the previous fraud, yet quietly construct the same mechanisms that will lead to the next one. The truth is that fraud rarely starts with malicious intent. It begins when ambition stretches beyond what reality can deliver, when expectations exceed capacity, and when the pressure to maintain a narrative becomes more powerful than the desire to confront the truth. The market rewards early success so aggressively that it often blinds itself to the foundation supporting that success. And so the cycle starts its ascent again. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3. Each time with different names, different technologies, different industries, but the same underlying psychology. Investors, eager to regain what they lost in the previous collapse, often become even more susceptible to risk. They chase the next big opportunity with the urgency of redemption. Boards, bruised by past failures, search for leaders who can restore their reputation quickly, even if their claims stretch believability. Regulators, overwhelmed by expanding markets and limited resources, shift their attention to the most recent scandal, leaving new sectors under-examined. And as these forces converge, they create fertile ground for the next illusion to bloom. Media plays a central role in this resurrection. Stories of resilience, innovation, and disruption dominate headlines. New visionaries are celebrated as the next generation of pioneers. Early success narratives spread rapidly, sometimes before the success itself has been verified. This renewed hunger for a hero creates the perfect environment for half-truths, inflated projections, and premature declarations of revolutions that have yet to materialize. The world wants a comeback story, and anyone who can deliver even the suggestion of one becomes the focus of attention and investment. But the most important factor that renews the cycle is psychological fatigue. People do not want to live in a state of perpetual skepticism. It is emotionally exhausting to question every claim, scrutinize every number, and analyze every promise. Eventually, society prefers the comfort of believing again. This willingness to trust, born from a desire to move forward, becomes the catalyst that powers the next fraud into existence. And so, without fanfare or warning, a new narrative begins to rise. One that looks different on the surface, but echoes the same patterns beneath. The cycle restarts not because the world is foolish, but because the structural incentives of the system remain unchanged, guiding financial behavior back toward the familiar architecture of illusion. When you step back and look at the patterns shaping today's financial landscape, it becomes impossible to ignore the uncomfortable truth. The system is once again entering the same psychological territory that defined every major fraud cycle in history. The hunger for innovation is overwhelming. Capital is flowing into narratives built on promise rather than proof. Markets reward confidence more than competence, and companies are celebrated not for what they have achieved, but for what they say they will achieve. These are not signs of stability. They are signals that the system is repeating the early moments of Stage 3, the phase where illusions become institutional. Across multiple sectors, from artificial intelligence to biotech, green energy, digital finance, and emerging technologies, growth is being projected far faster than it is being validated. Companies with unproven models are receiving valuations that assume decades of flawless execution. Startups claim breakthroughs that remain unverified. Metrics are presented in ways that favor excitement over clarity. And the financial world, driven by the desire to ride the next wave of transformation, rewards these narratives with more capital, more attention, and more public legitimacy. This is the same emotional environment that empowered Madoff's tranquil returns, Wirecard's manufactured expansion, and Theranos' medical fantasies. The stories differ, but the structure is identical. Investors want a hero. Governments want progress. Media wants a headline. And companies want to meet expectations that escalate faster than reality can support. In this environment, the gap between ambition and truth becomes dangerously easy to fill with exaggerations, selective reporting, or manufactured milestones. The cycle doesn't restart with deception. It begins with pressure. At the same time, regulatory systems are struggling to keep pace with the speed of innovation. Oversight is fragmented, outdated, or under-resourced. New sectors operate in gray areas where rules have yet to be defined. Carved-out exceptions, experimental frameworks, and rapid approval pipelines create cracks wide enough for manipulation to slip through unnoticed. And in these cracks, Stage 3 grows, quietly, confidently, and with the full support of a market that believes the future must arrive faster than the present can build it. Yet the most revealing indicator of our current stage is cultural. We celebrate founders not for their results, but for their audacity. We reward companies for raising capital, not for generating value. We admire ambition even when it lacks evidence, because evidence feels slow and ambition feels inspiring. This is the emotional fuel that powers Stage 3, turning optimism into a collective narrative that becomes nearly impossible to question. The illusion gains momentum because so many people want it to be real. If you reach this point, it means you followed the entire journey through the 6-stage financial cycle, and that already places you ahead of most observers. So, if this resonated with you, let me know you made it to the end by leaving a comment with the phrase, "I saw the pattern," and share what part of this cycle felt most familiar to what we see happening today. And if this kind of deep dive helps you understand the hidden mechanics shaping the financial world, make sure you subscribe and tap like so you stay connected as we explore the next chapter of this story. There is a video here on the side that continues this investigation from a new angle, so click and keep going. You're already deep into the pattern, and the next piece will make everything even clearer.